The uniteam ticket between the Duterte and Marcos political powerhouses swept the two political families to the president and vice president offices. Ferdinand Marcos Jr. replaced Rodrigo Duterte as president, and Sara Duterte became the new vice president. The unity that characterized the heyday of 2022 came crashing down in late 2024. A split that was nearly politically inevitable took a turn beyond a mere political rivalry. The Philippines, currently embroiled in a political dispute with China over their sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea, finds this news unwelcome. There are indications that China is not involved in the political crisis in Manila, but they stand to benefit from a focus on the Philippines internally, rather than on China's sovereignty threat. Vice President Sara Duterte and her Chief of Staff, Zuleika Lopez, were under investigation by the Philippine Congress over misuse of funds. Congress held Ms. Lopez in contempt and detained her for her lack of cooperation with the subpoena. Vice President Duterte then attempted to obstruct Ms. Lopez's transfer to a women's prison and, in a bizarre online news conference, threatened to have President Marcos, his wife, and the Speaker of the House, a Marcos ally, assassinated if she, Vice President Duterte, was to die. This undoubtedly sealed the ongoing rift between the two families, permanently eliminating any possibility of reconciliation or even civil discourse between them. The Philippine Congress initiated an investigation into allegations of fund misuse, threats, and obstruction against the Vice President. The investigation has progressed to the point where Congress is considering 3 or 4 impeachment charges against Ms. Duterte. According to a national poll, 41% of respondents support impeachment, while 35% oppose it, indicating a lack of national consensus and significant opposition to it at this time. Political supporters of both families are consolidating their support, as expected. President Marcos announced this week that he had issued an executive order to remove Vice President Duterte and her father, former President Rodrigo Duterte, from the country's National Security Council. Executive Secretary Lucas Bersamin defended the move, stating that not only did the president have the power to remove the Dutertes from the NSC, but he also needed to receive advice from advisors he could trust, confident that their advice was in the country's best interest. The vice president's public threats of assassination against the president and his wife suggest that the president no longer trusts him, a patented understatement. The spokesman for former President Rodrigo Duterte, Harry Roque, accused President Marcos of getting ready to declare martial law, just as his father had done in the past. Secretary Bersamin also refuted and criticized this charge. As a politician, President Marcos has also entered the political sphere and publicly stated that he is considering softening the country's opposition to the International Criminal Court, or ICC. The ICC has begun a probe of the former president, Duterte, over accusations that his drug war led to extrajudicial executions of drug offenders. A self-proclaimed hitman for President Duterte's Davao death squad, now a fugitive, reinforced this by claiming to have killed more than 50 people for the former president. The Philippine National Police declared their willingness to assist Interpol in the event of an arrest warrant for Duterte, despite the country's opposition to the ICC. A statement of this significance from the National Police would not have happened without the knowledge of President Marcos. The former president has been obstructive to President Marcos. Mr. Duterte regularly calls President Marcos a drug addict and says that he wants to end constitutional limits on his power. Earlier this year, Mr. Duterte called for the secession of Mindanao from the Philippines after he accused Mr. Marcos of creating a signature campaign to change the constitution. Supporters of Mr. Duterte have also called for a military coup to remove Mr. Marcos from office. This accusation compelled General Romeo Brawner Jr., the head of the Philippine Armed Forces, to unite with the Philippine National Police in opposition to the coup notion. The public position of the two organizations was to address political issues through the ballot box, not the military. The feud between the two clearly supports that keeping the Dutertes on the NSC would be a disruptive force and would allow the Dutertes an inroad to high-level government discussions. After a call for coup and assassinations against President Marcos, it is no wonder that he can view any advice or influence they could provide in the NSC as highly suspect. Both parties would likely keep their conversations confidential to avoid using them for political purposes against each other. Both the US and Japan have remained focused on the external threats to the Philippines, with the Japanese foreign minister set to meet with President Marcos in Manila in January. As a staunch supporter of the first Marcos administration, the US should refrain from intervening in the domestic political turmoil to avoid appearing to control the discourse. The US clearly prefers the continuation of a more predictable and supportive Marcos over a Duterte, who is more favored to a non-aligned status and is somewhat more unpredictable. Information security and handling in the Philippines must be updated if the Philippines armed forces want more advanced US weapons and intelligence support. The US has already started providing financial assistance with $500 million grants to improve joint bases and the security architecture. The US likely harbors reservations about progressing if Duterte and his supporters gain influence in the NSC, have access to US information and technology, or if a coup were to occur. Neither China, Japan, nor the US are interfering in the political crisis in the Philippines, but they all have a preferred outcome that they would like to see. The political risk for any party to interfere in Philippine politics is significant, as intervention in internal affairs could swing the Philippine populace decidedly in one direction against the party interfering in the domestic politics. On the other hand, the risk is significant, particularly for the US, should Marcos's political position erode and Duterte ascend to power. The Philippines is a key geographical ally in the control of the first island chain and keeping the South China Sea open for commerce, both of which are tied into the Taiwan question for the US and Japan, which is opposed by China.